Hello, everybody. I hope you're having a good day and a good week. I want to talk to you a little bit today about John Calvin and some of the ways in which John Calvin fits into a framework or category that we've been talking about in some other contexts as a Christian humanist. So, as a culture, we absolutely love polarizing figures. And by polarizing, I mean people who are either loved or hated, but there's not much in between. We see this in politics. A figure like Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders, these people have their faithful supporters. They also have their rabid detractors. But with both of these guys and a lot of other people in politics as well, there's not a lot of gray area in between. This can also even be true in something like sports. Someone like Tom Brady inspires these kinds of reactions as people line up either to denounce him as a symbol of everything that's wrong with professional football or to lift him up as a paragon of what makes sports great. But among sports fans, pretty much everyone has an opinion. And it's probably not surprising that these kinds of reactions to prominent men and women aren't new. They aren't an invention of the 21st century. We have these kinds of reactions, and we've seen these kinds of reactions to historical figures too, maybe especially in the history of the church. And today I want to talk a little bit about one of the most polarizing figures that Christianity has ever produced. And that's saying a lot. As you can guess, throughout the history of Christianity, there has been no shortage of interesting, provocative, and even upsetting characters. The man we'll be talking about today is a man who, both in his day and in ours, has inspired such wildly divergent opinions that sometimes it's hard to cut through all of that to see what he was really about. I'm talking, of course, about John Calvin. It's likely that if you've grown up in the church or spent much time in the church or read things about the church, at some point you've encountered John Calvin or his ideas, or maybe some caricature of his ideas. And these ideas, kind of like Calvin himself, have been presented in tones of reverent admiration at times and contemptuous scorn at other times, but probably not with detached indifference. In the later part of the 16th century, Theodore Beza produced one of the first biographical reflections on John Calvin, writing from a clear admiration of a man who had been an influential colleague as well as a friend. Beza says that in Calvin, all men may see a most beautiful example of Christian character, an example which it is as easy to slander as it is difficult to imitate. Will Durant, a 20th century cultural historian, had a less glowing perspective on Calvin. He wrote that we shall always find it hard to love the man who darkened the human soul with the most absurd and blasphemous conception of God in all the long and honored history of nonsense. So not a lot of gray area there. One of the most outspoken admirers of John Calvin today is the writer Marilynne Robinson. She has won numerous awards, including the Pulitzer Prize for writing some of the most beautiful novels about faith that have ever been produced. And in her estimation, if you want to look at the example of a life that is beautifully lived, you should look to John Calvin. In a recent interview, she said of Calvin, "He is extraordinarily humanistic. I don't know, even among modern theologians, I think there's no one to compare. To have lost him is a great loss." Now, these are just a few of the many strong opinions that speak to the kind of impact that Calvin has had, not only on his own time, but also on our time. It seems that everyone who has encountered Calvin, his ideas, or the followers who embrace those ideas, has felt the weight of his influence in a diverse array of contexts. We hear about Calvin's ideas and imprint in literature, in economics, and of course, in religious life. And part of what makes this legacy and these responses so interesting is that they seem to be so different from the way Calvin saw himself. Calvin didn't aspire to be the kind of world historical figure that would provoke strong statements from people who lived 500 years after he did. If anything, Calvin saw himself as a fairly reserved pastoral presence, with little regard for how he would be remembered. In fact, he said at one point in his younger days that his one great object was to live in seclusion without being known. Calvin doesn't seem to have been intent on building a legacy, but rather with doing the work that was in front of him, and with having something to offer to Reformation Christians as they sought to live out their faith in the midst of some tumultuous times. What I want to do today, very briefly, is provide a brief introduction to this influential and fascinating figure of the Protestant Reformation. We'll look a little bit at Calvin's life to reflect on who he was, but more than that, I want to look a little at some of the roles that Calvin occupied in his time. And to pick up on that image that Marilynne Robinson talked about, Calvin the humanist, so that we can see how Calvin's life and Calvin's career can help us understand what Renaissance humanism looked like when expressed within the context of the Protestant Reformation. So to begin with Calvin's early life, he was born in 1509 in a small town in France called Noyon. And his mother died when he was a young boy, and his father remarried. At the age of 12, Calvin's father sent him to Paris to start his training for priesthood, in really in the more traditional university mode. So Calvin goes to Paris to study theology. And while he's there, he took a master's degree. At the same time, he's pursuing humanistic studies, this approach to education that we've talked about, the well-rounded liberal education rooted in ancient texts. And this led Calvin to the writings of Erasmus, which you've already encountered. And this further encouraged him to read the classics. At the age of 20, he was urged by his father to pursue a career in law. So he went to law school and he studied hard. According to his friend Beza, he would study until midnight. Then he would wake up early in the morning to meditate on what he had read the previous night before jumping back into his studies. And Beza theorized that all of this studying and the poor eating habits that came with it might have actually ruined Calvin's health later in life. Well, after his father's death, Calvin decided that the full-time pursuit of a law career was not for him. And so he threw himself more intently into his humanistic studies. As a part of this, in 1532, at the age of 23, he published a commentary on Seneca, the Stoic philosopher. He spent a lot of his own money to self-publish this work, and he hoped it would establish his career as an important humanist, but it didn't have the impact that he would have liked. It wasn't as successful as he imagined it might be. Around this time, Calvin was reading more and more work by Christian humanists, especially Erasmus, and he was coming to learn more about the perspective that sought to use humanistic approaches and methods to understanding the gospel. He wanted to apply these humanistic techniques to the understanding of the faith. At the same time, Calvin is reading Martin Luther's work, and he is clearly impacted by some of the things that he's studying there. So by 1533, he's still a man in his early 20s, and he's finding himself more and more disillusioned with some of the excesses of the church, especially the selling of indulgences. He becomes connected to a group of like-minded young men in Paris, including a college rector named Nicholas Cop. And late in 1533, Cop delivered a sermon that angrily called for church reform. It's believed that maybe Calvin had a hand in helping to write the sermon. And as you may have guessed, the powers that be in France didn't exactly take too kindly to such ideas being proclaimed. When authorities tried to arrest Cop, he and Calvin both fled the city. And so for much of his adult life, Calvin is something of an exile. After he flees Paris, his movements are a little bit harder to track. He kind of bounces around France, staying with friends and working on things. He'll spend most of his time, though, in three places eventually: Basel, Strasbourg, and Geneva. And in these places, he will grow into his interconnected roles as a theologian and as a public leader. So first, let's look at Calvin the theologian. In some sense, this is where Calvin's impact is most strongly felt today. And the work of theological scholarship seems to have been a natural fit for him. Remember, he had spent years studying for the priesthood as well as studying law, and all of this had unfolded within the context of his interest in humanistic studies. And these early pursuits laid the foundation for the scholarship, the theological work that he would produce throughout his career. The first major work that Calvin produced, remarkably, was the first edition of his Institutes, when he was only 26 years old. You've probably heard of the Institutes. It's on pretty much everyone's short list as one of the most influential Christian texts ever produced. And the Institutes started off as a kind of defense of the Reformation faith to the French king. It was also a context in which Calvin was, like the best theologians, working out what he believed, wrestling with the ideas of Christian humanism that he had encountered through Erasmus, applying these ideas to the teachings about Christianity that he had read in Luther and other reformers. And of course, applying these things to what he read in the Bible. Eventually, the Institutes would grow into a much larger work, a sort of textbook in theology that explored a wide range of topics, from law and faith to prayer and the sacraments, to a long section on church and civil government. And if you've heard just a little bit about Calvin's theology, there's probably one word that is popping into your head right now. You probably have this perception of him as someone who is obsessed with the idea of predestination. This notion that God predestines some people to eternal salvation and others to eternal damnation, and there's not much that we can do about it. And while Calvin does talk about that doctrine, it actually occupies a very limited space in the much larger context of his discussion of grace and justification by faith. And of course, it occupies a much smaller space when seen in relation to the much larger work of the Institutes. There's a lot more going on in this work than predestination. In the spirit of the Renaissance and in the spirit of some of the other writers that we've encountered, Calvin has this desire to address faith as a matter that comes to bear on how we live in this world. He wants to present things in terms of both the church and society, and the Institute shows this. But throughout this work, throughout a number of revisions, one of the things that is so fascinating is how deeply Calvin engages classical learning in this text. It was common for theologians to talk about Aristotle and Plato, but Calvin took this further, beyond what a lot of Christian theological treatises had been doing for centuries. Throughout the Institutes, Calvin cites figures like Homer and Virgil, Plutarch and Ovid, and numerous others, especially Cicero. Calvin seems to view Cicero as a kind of conversation partner who, through his reflections on natural law, helps Christians come to a deeper understanding of God's law. These were writers that the humanists of Calvin's time had rediscovered, the writers that they were really enthusiastic about. And it's clear from his writing that Calvin loved these thinkers as well. A second major project of Calvin theologian, one that continued throughout his career, involved his commentaries on Scripture. Several scholars have argued that Calvin was the greatest commentator on Scripture of his time. He wrote commentaries on most of the Old Testament books and on every New Testament book except Revelation. And one of the things, maybe the most important thing, that made him such an extraordinary commentator was Calvin's attention to languages. Now remember, for the humanists of the Renaissance, it was absolutely necessary to learn the original languages that these ancient texts had been written in. For those studying the Bible, like Erasmus and later Calvin, this meant the mastery of Greek and Hebrew, along with Latin. Calvin embraced this idea wholeheartedly. He loved studying languages and applying what he learned to the study of Scripture. Calvin looked at the work of a number of scholars of the Middle Ages as careless and imprecise. He couldn't believe that some theologians and church leaders of his time didn't think it was important to study language rigorously. And all of this dedication shows in Calvin's commentaries. You probably know the difference between those who have spent a couple of years studying a foreign language in high school and those who have been immersed in a language. One of the main signs that someone really knows a language is that they'll be able to pick up on figures of speech and idioms that non-native speakers usually don't get. Calvin was proficient in recognizing these figures of speech that are evident in Hebrew and Greek, these things that can add new meaning to a text. He was able to point out minute details in the text and to that more superficial readings would ignore. He was able to analyze the biblical texts in a deeper way, to wrestle with what these texts said in a manner that was indicative of his humanist commitment to knowledge. So because of these interests, Calvin was able to advance the study of Scripture in some important ways. And even if we don't agree with all of his conclusions, we have to respect his commitment to getting back to the study of the sources of Scripture and struggling with the text in a rigorous way. Finally, we see Calvin's humanism on display and his interest in the art of rhetoric. In his study on the writings of Scripture, he liked to point out their eloquence, their ability to persuade the reader to embrace the gospel, and he sought to implement these same techniques in his own speaking and writing. So throughout his career, we see Calvin embracing the methods that had been developed by classical rhetoricians, establishing credibility, making a sound argument, maybe most of all, connecting with the audience. In fact, Calvin saw Scripture itself as a sort of act of rhetoric on God's part. It was God's divine act of connecting with the audience. So God's spoken words that we could understand, Calvin said. He accommodated the message to us in a way that we might be persuaded by it. A commitment to this approach in Calvin's own work is evident in his preaching and his writing. And one example of a decisively persuasive work is his reply to Sadoleto. Sadoleto was a cardinal of the Roman Church. He was a Christian humanist himself, who during a tumultuous time in Geneva, a time when Calvin had been forced outside the city, Sadoleto wrote to the citizens of Geneva. He urged them to leave Reformation Christianity behind and to return to the Roman Church. And at this point, Calvin is kind of happily in exile from Geneva. He's ministering to a smaller community in Strasbourg. But the elders of Geneva come to him and they ask him for help. So Calvin gives support to the resistance to Sadoleto. Calvin replied to Sadoleto's letter in a way that sought to provide a defense of the Reformed faith with eloquence. He responded with an open letter that addressed Sadoleto's arguments and offered counter arguments. He persuaded the Genevans to remain committed to the Reformed idea. And throughout this letter, as with a number of Calvin's works, his commitment to effective rhetoric, to using the best ideas of the past and applying those ideas to powerful communication, is on display. Now, Calvin might have been happiest if he had just been left alone to study and to write. But perhaps by necessity, he was a public figure as well. And in his role as a pastor, Calvin exhibited his gifts for leadership, although it took him a while to get there. Just after his exile from France, Calvin passed through Geneva. He intended to stay there for a short time before going to Strasbourg to write. But he was persuaded by one of the leaders of the church there, a man named William Farel, who had heard of Calvin's reputation. He was persuaded to stay and to help the struggling group of Protestant Christians. Calvin believed that God was speaking to him, and he reluctantly agreed to stay. But he didn't become a preacher right away. He took his time and eased into a position of leadership, becoming ordained after spending some time with the church as a lay minister. He became a reader in the church, and then ultimately he did become ordained as a minister. And when he embarked on his work as a preaching minister, he jumped into it completely, as he did pretty much everything in his life. He would preach twice on Sunday and then up to 5 times throughout the week. As a pastor, as someone who preaches myself, I can say that the thought of preaching 7 times a week absolutely terrifies me. And Calvin had a practice of preaching through entire books of the Bible, chapter by chapter and verse by verse. He once preached 174 sermons in a row on the book of Ezekiel. So he and his congregation would spend years sometimes just immersed in one book, really engaging it deeply. In fact, one of my favorite stories about Calvin comes after a brief period when he was kicked out of Geneva following a dispute. Ultimately, he was invited back to resume leadership of the church. And when he got in the pulpit after being gone for 3 years, everyone was wondering what he was going to say. Was he going to let them have it for kicking him out? Was he going to preach a sort of, hey, it's good to be back message? Well, when Calvin stood up to preach, he just picked up with the exact chapter and verse where he had left off 3 years before. So even in his preaching, you see that careful attention to the text, as well as a legal approach to argument, a commitment to rhetoric and eloquence, evident just as it was in his writing. He was able to preach for long periods, expounding on all kinds of themes found in just a few verses of scripture, usually without even using notes. So he demonstrated his remarkable depth of learning and knowledge that had shaped his life. In addition to his preaching, as a pastor, Calvin also assumed a strong role of administration in both the church and the city. He believed that the improvement of society depended on the improvement of human beings. And so the work of the church was central to the betterment of the city. Now, Calvin's time in Geneva was hard. As with a lot of people who set out to try to reform society, he found that the people were resistant to some of his ideas. And there has been a lot written about Calvin's moral and disciplinary reforms of the church and the possible excesses of these reforms. In fact, along with the Calvinist concept of predestination, the nature of Calvin's reforms in Geneva has probably led to the most criticism of John Calvin. But what I want to highlight today is the central place that education played in Calvin's leadership. He referred to the church as the school of God. He believed that in order for the church to be the church that it was intended to be, it had to take seriously the job of educating both the young people and the ministers of the church. So one of Calvin's projects was to develop a catechism for the children of Geneva. A catechism is an instructional tool based on questions and answers that the student must memorize as a way of learning the faith. Beyond this, Calvin met regularly with young ministers to train them and mentor them in their work. But one of the greatest achievements of Calvin, the Christian humanist, came in his establishment of the Genevan Academy in the later part of his life. He had written upon his return to Geneva in 1541 that ministers should be trained in sacred doctrine, that is theology. But he also wrote that such instruction is useless without the languages and the humanities. So a college would be established to prepare students for both the ministry and also for their political, civic responsibility. Near the end of Calvin's life, this vision was realized. The curriculum of the Genevan Academy, which still operates today, is rooted in humanistic studies. Students would start by learning Latin grammar and rhetoric, and they would study Virgil and Cicero to do this. They would begin studying Greek in the 4th year. They learned Hebrew from the Old Testament. They learned history from Roman historians and philosophy from classical arguments rather than medieval textbooks. So as Calvin trained up the next generation of ministers, it was crucial to him that their education would be grounded in Christian humanism, the same kind of study that had formed him, the same kind of study that had sustained him in his work, and that had made it possible for his legacy to endure, not just in the realm of theology, but in a wide swath of Western culture 500 years later. Thanks for your attention.